What we know about her is that Mark 16:9 says that Mary was the one of whom out was cast 7 demons. Now, in Luke chapter 8, verse 2, it says 7 demons were cast from her. The problem is a chapter before in Luke 7, there's an unnamed woman who was a prostitute. People tag her with the other woman. Like having 7 demons isn't a bad enough set of problems. Shalom, I'm Dr. Randall Smith from Christian Travel Study Programs, and we are looking forward to spending some more time with you and exploring the lands of the Bible. You know, I've been traveling the region of the Mediterranean. Here I am by the Aegean Sea on the island of Mykonos in Greece. But I've been traveling for 35 years, trying to expose and show people the context of the biblical narrative. For these last couple of decades, we've been making these videos site by site, trying to expose who was Jesus, who were the people that followed him, what happened as a result of the gospel message as it left a small group of men huddled on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, all the way out into the regions of Rome and Greece and the spread of the gospel message. Thanks for joining us for this series of Exploring the Lands of the Bible. Each one of our sites will be picked up in this series as we try to expose the background. And we're hoping that you will learn more and that the Bible will be more deeply meaningful to you. Even if you can't come on the tour, at least you can experience some of what we do as we make the journey together. Thanks for joining us in Exploring the Lands of the Bible. Hi, I'm Dr. Randall Smith with Christian Travel Study Programs, and today we're going to be looking at one of the exciting excavations that's relatively new in the Holy Land. It's that of Magdala. Now, Mary of Magdala reminds us that there's another story in the New Testament, the story not only of the disciples and Jesus, but of these women that are supporters of Jesus. So let's take a look at the background of Magdala and look at its harbor, look at its downtown, and look at the exciting finds of a synagogue that were found there, just one of 7 synagogues from the ancient period that has now recently been uncovered. Join us as we head to Magdala. Magdala, that's where we're going now. There are 4 areas to the excavation. There's a synagogue, there's an industrial complex, there are a series of mikvaot, or ritual baths, and a port area. But let me tell you why I want you to go there. First of all, there's a synagogue found from the time of Jesus, and we only have a few of those from the period. And this one is exciting because it's in a city that is well known to Jesus, right underneath of his nose. Second, and by the way, it's kind of funny, the Israel Antiquities Authority, when they came out, what was happening was they were going to build this visitor center. And so the guys went down, and then when they dug their first hole, they hit some tesserae of a mosaic. And they said, oops. So they called the IAA. The IAA came in. They brought in their trucks, and they brought in these lights, these gas lights, and they began to work that evening. They dug one hole, and the first hole they dug was the most important thing they found in the dig. They found right there a stone that was a loft stone from inside the synagogue, and I'm going to show you the stone and show you the motifs on the stone. But what's interesting is that's the very first thing he found, a stone from inside of a synagogue marked with synagogue markings. And they said, stop, everybody, don't touch anything. And then an excavation began. Now, the deal is this, guys, this is the neatest place because they have a chapel that they've added. I call it the other 12. This is the story of the not so prominent but incredibly important 12 women in the Gospels. It's the chapel dedicated to the other 12. And here's what I can tell you. Guys, can I tell you honestly, I'm embarrassed to say this out loud, but having studied the Gospels and written books on the Gospels, I missed the other 12. Something about my worldview, I looked past them. So I want to take you to a chapel as part of our visit that talks about the other people that brought the first person to say he is risen was a lady. By the way, that was to replace the first woman in the garden who blew it. That was the idea. So the offsetting two gardens, right? In this garden, she dropped the ball. In that garden, she was clinging to Jesus, okay? And so there's supposed to be a juxtaposition of those two things. But I just want to share with you some stories of the women of the Gospels because it touched my heart to actually go through the process of looking at the other 12. And so hopefully that'll be helpful to you as well. Okay, guys, directly behind me and alongside of me is the port area. If you get the chance to walk down in Tiberias, there's a little quay or port area where there's a bunch of restaurants along the edge of the water. And they stand, maybe 8 or 10 feet above the surface of the water, sometimes even higher, depends on the level of the sea. Now, what we know is that that's something like what this looked like, not restaurants, but there was actually a frontal buttress wall that the water lapped right up to, and there were some docks here. So this is the port area, and what they found are parts of 3 large buildings. One of them's directly behind me here, the other 2 are over here to the right. Now, what they were doing here was taking the goods and services that came through the Arbel Pass. Remember that the Via Maris, so the way of the sea, came up and cut across the Jezreel Valley and came out either here at the base between Mount Nite and Mount Arbel, or sometimes during the wet time around the other way, but they would stop here for a shipping point. The shipping point allowed Herod Antipas to tax everything going out. So if it's heavy goods going over to, let's say, Damascus, normally they're going to be shipped over to the other side and be marked for taxing and port taxes here. In Mark 14, Jesus feeds 5,000 people, but it says that he fed them from 5 loaves and 2 salt fish. That's the kind of thing they're shipping from here. So directly related to our story is stuff that was produced probably here. Does it mean it's the only place they do it? No. It's just that's the name of the town, so it must be a significant part of their revenue. When Josephus talks about the first revolt against Rome in 66 to 73, when finally Masada falls, during that period, there were 5,000 ships that launched from Magdala against the Romans. Now, most every scholar would say Josephus loves zeros. He probably put 1 too many. Okay? In other words, he inflates things. Why does he do that? Because Josephus, whose name is Flavius Josephus, is adopted into the Flavian family, having been a failed general among the Jewish people. And as a result, he has to write what's called a res gestae. It's a how I look good as the emperor. Okay? And so what he's trying to do is make Vespasian and Titus look like they were up against a bigger force than they probably were, in order to make it look more Roman, like we really took somebody big. But nevertheless, imagine many, many ships launching here against Romans as part of the battle. Believing that the Romans would be unable to get their hands on many ships, they felt that they could go out to the center and attack the Romans at different points using the boats. They underestimated the engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers that was with the Romans to be able to put together boats on site. And of course they lost the battle. But that was only one part of a battle that went on and on and on, and finally the last place the flag was flying was Masada, right? So that's probably a critical juncture of that battle was launched from here. But this is the port area, and to be honest with you, it's not in a good state of preservation. I'd like to take you to some other parts of the dig that are actually much, much better to show you what people lived like in Magdala, okay? Okay, I want you to notice there is a wall line here, and it's one big rectangle right in front of us. If you want to see what the building looked like put together, they have a reasonably good diagram here. So this building is a single building, but the building itself is not just a home. It is a home, but it's more than just a home. On this end of the building, you'll notice that these rooms are living spaces. So here's what you do. One of the style homes, it's different than the style home than you saw yesterday. You saw a 3-room cave style home yesterday. These are called insulas, plural insuli style homes. And insulus it's the word for island. So I want you to imagine you buy a piece of property, this square or rectangular piece. When you buy it, you then put a wall all the way around it in the first generation. And then let's say Mike has bought this property. Mike and Laura would live in this corner right there in that room. Then their daughters, of course, would go off to marry whoever and live in their homes. But Lucas would end up in the house next to him right here. So he would build another room right next to it. Now, this house isn't just a home. How do I know? Look at the long stones on the far end. Those long stones tell you that there's something in the basement below. So those were actually a roof of a lower area. Sometimes you'll find, like up in the Golan, there would be wines kept below the floor. Here, there will actually be ritual baths showing that it is an industrial complex because people need to ritually bathe as part of the industries that they're doing. So this is just one home. It looks like a real sizable home, right? Until you realize that living in it could be 80 people. But they all have the same last name, grandma cooks, and no one complains about the meals, okay? So it's a condo block for one family. This one is half industrial, half living space. I'm gonna show you some that are all living space in Capernaum in a little bit.
Because we saw those at Bethsaida, we saw the same sort of thing.
Sure, you'll see it in the Bethsaida.
The wine guy was
the winekeeper's room, right, exactly. You'll also see them up in Chorazin, but there it's going to be monoliths that are there for baptismal purposes. So those are the two places you see them. How do I know it's industrial? Well, do you see underneath that there's water flowing? There's a water channel. That means whatever they're doing, they need water. Brining, salting, these are things you need water flow for. So they've got water underneath. It's not clean drinking water. It's water you're using for industrial purposes. Now, the interesting thing about Magdala is the site actually is a singular occupation site. So what we know is it's here during the period of the New Testament and here and destroyed at the first revolt. So this is another piece of the building. It's actually two buildings, one on my side and one on the other side of the street, but the better ones are over just yonder just to see. All of this area doesn't have the underground canal in it, so we think it's not industrial, it's strictly for domestic use, for housing. But the next area, we know for sure what it is. Yeah, you know what, if you want to see one of the mosaics, the tesserae of the mosaics, look at the violence that occurred here as the walls came down and it actually broke into the top of the tesserae of the mosaic. So these are individual pieces of stone set into a plaster setting, and notice that they have what is often referred to as a meander pattern on the outside. There are two different types of them. This is one type. These small rooms are part of a larger complex. Now look at the finished floor here. Stone that is dressed is stone that is chiseled. Why is it important to us? Because chisels are stylistic. Imagine you're calling in people from 5 different crews to build a building. How do you keep the stone looking the same? You have everyone buy the same craftsman chisel. Now, what's important for us archaeologically is if there's 8 pits to the inch, that is grooves on the chisel end, that's going to be from just before the time of Jesus, Herod the Great. Everybody used that style chisel. So often I can tell you when a stone was cut. I can't tell you when it was put where it is, but I can tell you when it was cut. Okay? So for our purposes, it's important just to know the ages of the stones. These stones are black rocks basalt. You're familiar with basalt already, but it's a volcanic rock that's high in metallic content, so it's incredibly hard to dress predictably. It'll chip, but it's hard as all get out to try and get it done. And so it lasts very well. All right, let's stop along here. We'll come halfway. Come on down. Something strange happens when you're studying your Bible and you find that you come to the end of Malachi, and between Malachi and Matthew there are these several hundred years, and Christians often refer to them as the silent years. God is not silent. He didn't stop talking. There were people who were experiencing God in every generation. The difference was the prophets were no longer writing down and giving messages in the written form. And so for a time, God held back the writing of the story in order to reposition people. And so during that period between Malachi and Matthew, the Jewish people were largely in Babylon, and then they're making their way back. And only, if you read Ezra and you go on and you look at Ezra's actually 2 different books, right? The first part is Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel and their return. And the last few chapters is much, much later. So the first part's 538 to 536 BC. The second part's 458. So it's a lot later, and it's the last few chapters, and they're coming back. But you're only going to find 50,000 is a big number coming back. By the time of Jesus, most Jews don't live inside Israel. There are more of them in the dispersion outside of the country than inside the country. Several things appear during that time that you're just supposed to understand. So you've read all the way from Genesis to Malachi, and there's nothing called baptism. There's not a single rabbi in the story. You have priests, you have prophets, no rabbis. You have temple, no synagogue. You have baptism shows up in Matthew, and you open up with John standing there in the middle of the Jordan River. Where is he talking about baptism from? Well, this comes out of the rabbis' understanding during the time they went into Babylon. So think of it this way. Babylon was the greatest, longest history of legal descriptions and legal language. Babylon was a lawyer town. When you take Jews who have a certain flexibility in the law, like David goes in to the table of showbread and eats the bread, and the earth doesn't open up and swallow him, there's a certain flexibility that seemed to exist at the time of David that doesn't exist at the time of Jesus. By the time of Jesus, if I spit on a rock on the Sabbath, I'm okay, but if I spit on the ground, I'm tilling the soil. What happened to Judaism? Babylon happened. They went into captivity in a lawyer town and came out lawyers. And so you have an entire different understanding. Now, as lawyers start examining things, you know how lawyers are. I don't know if any of you are lawyers. I'm offending somebody already. But lawyers have a way of making things simpler by making them 20 pages longer. Right? See the fine print. The large print giveth, the small print taketh away. Okay? Now, here's the point. If you know any lawyers up close, this is the truth. This is their psychology. They'll tell you right up front, 1 sentence on what they'll do, and 20 sentences undoing the first sentence. So basically, I'm willing to do this, but I can't in any way represent that I would do any of the following things that vaguely sound like what I said I would do. And you shake their hand and pay them. Now, the issue was baptism. How is God going to give us back our land? Well, they concluded by looking at the prophecies of Ezekiel, which are tremendous prophecies, and because most Christians don't read the 48 chapters of Ezekiel, all weird stuff comes from there, okay? But actually there's 4 different visions in the book, and the book opens, with the wheels and all of that. Why does he have 3 chapters of a vision of his own call? Because God's not going to use you deeply if you don't know him well. So it's the grasp of understanding who he is that's going to determine the depth of the mission he can give you. And because Ezekiel gets, in my opinion, the worst job in the Hebrew Scriptures, I mean, lie on your side for a couple of 100 days and we'll talk, all right? Here's the bottom line. He has to have a deep view of God. The book of Ezekiel actually is 48 chapters. Halfway through in 24, his wife dies. And God says, you can't cry. You're not allowed. And he doesn't know for months later that that's the day the temple fell. And God wanted to use that man deeply by wounding him with the same wound God felt. So that he would be, the second half of the book is unbelievably positive and uplifting compared to the first half. Why? Because he learned something through the toughness of the experience. Now, in the second half of the book, it literally says that I'm going to sprinkle clean water on you and make you clean. And I'm going to take that heart of stone out of you and put in you a heart of flesh. And I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. So the rabbis, looking at the language, determined, hey, water plus repentance equals get rid of pig-eating pagans and get our land back. Okay, we can do that. And so John's baptism was literally come down into the water, repent, get wet, get ready, we're going to have our land back. Now here's the thing. If you get ready, I will then move the Romans away. And that's the real thing that's on the heart of it. The reason they're gathering around John is just not because he's a weird dresser and a compelling speaker. I mean, what does he eat? What does John the Baptizer eat? Locusts and honey. Now, locust can be the locust bean. It can be the carob bean. But it also could be the insect, except for their back legs get caught in your teeth and it's not a nice experience. But they are protein. You can eat them. And, you know, it's nice that you can have a kosher little protein snack and they just grow on trees. The problem is that if he's doing the locust bean, it's a chocolate substitute with honey. John the Chocoholic. Now, what does he wear? Camel skin. Now, the thing you should know about camels is they secrete their own deodorant. But if you kill the camel, he doesn't secrete anything. So when you buy camel hair, it's treated camel hair. What you would never do is buy camel hair, wear it, and do things like baptize or get wet. So it's John, smell him before you see him, the Chocoholic. And he's supposed to be weird because the gospel writer's contrasting him with Jesus, who's perfectly normal in his society. And what does that tell you? It says that God uses the weird ones, which is why some of you are here. Yes, let's just be honest. Okay, so baptism was in the form of baptism. It wasn't done the way John did it. The original form is what I'm going to show you here. The original form is a pool that has a set of steps. Normally there are 6 steps. It normally has about 70 gallons of water. It has to come from a living or flowing source. And guys, if you are riveted by this discussion, can a woman go into a baptismal? You do this in the nude. Can she put a coin in her mouth, close her mouth, so that the water of the baptism does not hit the coin, but the coin only gets wet from saliva? Is she fully baptized or not? If you like that kind of discussion, you will love the Talmud, okay? Because that's riveting. That's 4 pages right there. It's an interesting discussion. But the whole thing is, how do you do it? Now listen to me carefully. In the absence of a vibrant relationship, you have only technique to discuss. See Cosmopolitan magazine. Yeah. Technique is the whole thing. Some of you got it. My point is, in the absence of a vibrancy of relationship, you discuss technique. And so what happens is Judaism becomes consumed with the legal technique of, when I go in, here's what I do. Ladies, you would take your hair, tie it all up under your hand, put it on top of you. You would disrobe, you would go inside. You would step down until you were up to your neck. Your chin would touch the water. You would call for the attendant to see. You would thrust your head beneath the water. The attendant would exit. But the hairs on the back of your knuckles must be wet. Everything, nothing between you and the water. So technically the coin only wet by saliva means it's not a full baptism. Okay. Now the point is, that's what you have to do. Every time your body excretes anything besides sweat or tears, you must be mikvahed to go back in the temple. Remember, so Mary, after the days of her purification being ended, would go and be mikvahed, and she'd go into the temple. That's just the normal thing you're doing. And the important thing about this is, gentlemen, you're coming in, you're being mikvahed regularly. This is an important part of your life. So Jews were baptized many times in their life, not once. The form of baptism changed in the early church. In the Christian form, they dunked not once, but 3 times in a Trinitarian formula. That was a 200-year discussion. The first guy that only dunked once was kicked out as a heretic because he wasn't Trinitarian. Now, here's what we know. John wasn't doing it nude. I failed to see a whole bunch of religious Jews frolicking naked into the Jordan. I don't think that's what was going on there. I'm just going out on a limb here. What I think they were doing is something different. Here's the normal form. Then there was the Christian form. Here's what I can tell you. There's a lot of different forms representative of baptism, even among this group. It doesn't appear to me that the form was specified in Scripture, but the meaning was. So would you do me a favor? Whatever your form is, make sure it follows your meaning, okay? I'm not sure that God is as concerned about the form as what it is we're trying to say. Symbols have to have meanings. Let me say it this way. There are some people who shouldn't take their wedding ring off ever. It means something to have it on. They need to leave it on. Others, he's working with metal shop. He needs to take his ring off. It's no big deal. It depends on what the symbol is and how heavy it is in who you are. So later on, we're going to find that there are other symbols added in the church. What's a symbol that's added in the early church? What's that? Yeah, I'm talking about symbolic things you do. Okay, washing of feet. Communion. These are what we would call ordinances, capital O ordinances. They're capital O because they're things Jesus instructed. Do this in remembrance of me. Are there any others? Okay, there'll be a form of offering that is instructed in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. What else? When you went in to a chapel, gentlemen, you all took your hats off. Why?
Covered, uncovered.
So 1 Corinthians 11, women went in with their head covered, men with them uncovered. Now, here's an interesting thing that happens with symbols. In the New Testament period at the time of Corinth, all women wore coverings for everything. Pagan, not pagan, they always wore a covering in every public setting. So they didn't care that he said, you need to have it covered. The offense was that men had to take their cap off. Because a Roman, when if he was a slave that became freed, you know what the symbol of a slave that was set free is? A Smurf hat. It's actually a Phrygian cap. It's a cap. And when you see a cap on a Roman, this says, I am a free Roman. And in going into the church, they were said, gentlemen, take it off. You're not free, you're a slave. So the symbol of slavery of Jesus Christ was the removal of your hat. The next time, guys, you walk into a place and you take your hat off, please understand you're doing something more in 1 Corinthians 11 than saying, I just want to be respectful, Emily Post. No, I'm doing this because I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. I'm not a free man. And that was offensive to a Roman, but they needed to learn to do it. Okay? All right, let's keep going. Okay, I want to take you around to the most exciting part of this dig. Okay, guys, let's take a look at just a couple of features of the excavation that are here, okay? Behind me is the synagogue. Now, this is a synagogue, contemporary, first century synagogue, contemporary to our gospel story. So you'll notice that there are dressed stones at the beginning, stones that are carved or cut around the doorway. And the dressed stones led you into a small chamber, an antechamber, and then there's a center room. Now, as many as 100 to 150 people could be inside this synagogue. There are 2 layers to the synagogue. There's the stone layer, and then up where they're replacing the mosaics, That was put there during the time of Claudius. That's between 41 and 54 AD, the Emperor Claudius. During that time, they added a nice new mosaic floor, which means they're doing well at this synagogue. But when they found this, do you notice that there's a pillar on one side and a pillar in the back, a pillar here, but there's another pillar missing. And parts of the entry were disassembled. They're over here. Look at that. This happened when the revolt against Rome began. What they did was disassemble this so that they could make a barricade in the street to fight against the Romans. So they found this disassembled already. They literally took the synagogue apart to defend against the onslaught of the Romans. So there's a cool dramatic moment that's played out here.
So were these found like that?
They were found exactly like that. And they are clearly, from here, disassembled, and we've got the date for the disassembly. Because in 67, they're fighting. And so in order to fight the Romans, they've got to barricade the streets. So this is a very old strategy. It didn't start with Les Miserables. You know, they were doing this long before. But look at that. So literally, you're tearing down your synagogue. Now, the synagogue is exciting just because it's a touch point for Jesus' story. But probably the most incredible part of it was the first thing they found. When they first stuck a spade down, they went down 8 inches and hit a stone. And that stone right there, that's a replica. There's a stone inside here. And I want to show you the stone because,
that's right there?
see, that's the replica, okay?
Oh, that's the replica.
That's your stone.
Oh, that's the
And the idea here is that this stone was found in the very first shovel hit. Now, what is the stone? Well, it's an elevation or a platform. Usually a speaker speaks from a bama or a raised place, but it could also be used for the holding of scrolls. It may have sat on a wooden table or some kind of frame. We don't really know. What we know is that the symbolism on it is a metaphor for worship. And the only place we can find a first century, what were people communicating in the synagogue, besides the record in the Mishnah and then later the Talmud, what is the actual symbolism that they're using? So from right where I'm standing, can you see the back of that? Now notice that along the side, down the sides are actually some stalks of wheat with 3 arches, but on the back that's facing us, do you see some wheels? Okay? And below them, do you see some flashes of lightning or some kind of sparkle? This is the touch of God, the vision of God himself, as was found in Ezekiel 1-3. That's why I started to tell you about Ezekiel when we were standing over there. Because the story of Ezekiel touching God, or God touching Ezekiel and calling him in Ezekiel 1-3 is on the side. On the top of it, there's a rosette pattern. Okay? The rosette is 6 petals around with 6 petals on the inside, or 12 tribes of Israel. But we only find it used on the faces of ossuaries or bone boxes, and here facing upward. It's the interface of heaven with earth. It was also, according to Josephus, on the parochet, or the hanging cloth between the holy place and Holy of Holies. So the interface between where God touches man. So the whole theme of this stone, and on the stone is actually a representation of the menorah with a tripart lampstand on it, the way Exodus 25 said the original one was made of a talent of gold. That's 100 pounds of gold. Okay? Then on top, at the bottom, there's also some pictures of the table of showbread, showing that what they're talking about from this end is the supply of God to the menorah in the oil that's in the vases, to the top of the table of showbread, around to the far side where Ezekiel actually encounters God. Okay, so the stone itself then becomes a metaphor for the actual experience of worship, the touching of God. And what's important for us is that what they're doing in the center of the synagogue. Guys, focus for a second on this. There is in the entire country one place where God met man, and where was it? In the temple in Jerusalem. We now know that metaphorically they're telling that story in a stone in the middle of a synagogue. So we used to be able to say that in the temple, what's the main point of the temple? What do they do there? When you think of worship, though, see, some people when they say worship, they mean sing. Some people mean pray. What do they mean? Okay, specifically, when you think of a temple, what do you think of? Sacrifice. Okay, it's about smoke. It's about animals dying and getting grilled. That's what it's about. Okay. Now, the idea then is the smoke, the sacrifice, the blood, but Christians think that the temple was all about sin. My Jewish friends would say it more like this. It was a great place of Jewish identity and celebration. Oh, and yes, we also sinned. In other words, most of the feasts and festivals were oriented around things that happened at the temple, not necessarily related to sin at all. If you've been here before, this project began in 2005. And the project initially found when they discovered that first rock and then began to dig. But the idea of the project was to put a chapel here and a counseling center. Magdala was over there. An excavation had existed since the 1960s, and we knew that Franciscan Magdala was way over there. Nobody knew it went all the way out to the road. This is a bigger city than Tiberias was. Now, Tiberias was the capital, but the problem is Mount Berenike constricted Tiberias up against the side of the sea, so it couldn't spread out. So there was a lower Tiberias and an upper Tiberias. Here, there was no mountain. The plain of Migdal here left a lot of space, so they could just spread out and sprawl out. So nobody thought that the city was going to be as big as it is. So when they came digging over here, they bought a farmer's field and they thought for sure nothing's going to be here. Well, when they started digging and found that now you're sitting on top of part of Magdala, it means it was way over there, it's out here, it's underneath of us, and it goes all the way back to the road. And we don't even know the full extent of the site. But found was the synagogue and some ritual baths showing that the people who worked here were religious Jews, practicing Jews. But what's important is they're next to the industrial complex, meaning, look, Migdal is the word for tower. The other name for this site is called Terakia. Terakia means salt fish. So it's a big tower where they make fish jerky. Okay? That's what it is. But they do it in kosher law, and they get ritually bathed regularly. And so you're talking about a religious Jewish community that ships its dried fish jerky everywhere. The important thing about the whole site, another way to talk about Migdal was not only the word tower, but the Aramaic form of the word is the word for splendor, something big, something glorious. And so now we realize it was a big and very sprawling city that made fish jerky with a tower, okay? And so we're actually adapting as we dig. Now what's interesting to me is that when I started to do a study, I looked at these women of the New Testament because obviously Mary of Magdala is going to be the key featured person of this story. Several people are working on the site. A gal by the name of Jennifer, who operates in the site, is doing scholastic studies and has published scholastic studies on Mary Magdalene. We actually don't have near as much information as people think we have. And part of it is confused. What we know about her is that Mark 16:9 says that Mary was the one of whom out was cast 7 demons. Now, in Luke chapter 8, verse 2, it says, 7 demons were cast from her. The problem is a chapter before in Luke 7, there's an unnamed woman who was a prostitute. People tag her with the other woman. Like having 7 demons isn't a bad enough set of problems. So we have no evidence that she was involved in the sex trade at all. The woman in chapter 7 is probably not her. Why? Because that woman's not named and she is a chapter later. So my thinking is these are 2 different people. But what I can tell you is Mary had a life interrupted. The demonic occupation of her body meant that she didn't have the normal ties to a family. She wasn't somebody's mama, somebody's wife. as best we know, she was a woman apart. And I want to stop and I want to say this forcefully. One of Satan's greatest tools is isolation. If he can separate you out, and listen to me, if he can make you believe you're not like other people, it's always the one that travels alone that gets hunted first. And I would tell you this, Mary lived a life apart so that once she had those 7 demons removed, she had the ability to follow Jesus in a unique way. I don't care where you come from. I care about the choices that determine where you're going. Because honestly, where you come from, look, that's the cards you were dealt. But the choices you make with them are how you play the game. And I would say more important than your pedigree and more important than your past are your choices. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be able to preach Christ. If I thought that you're locked into a spiraling death grip from the beginning, and by the way, when you work in a society that is, let's say, a reincarnation-oriented society, or a society that believes in such a caste that you'll never break out, hope is lost. People can live without food. They can't live without hope. I looked through the Gospels, and here's what I found. She had a seedy past, a demonic past, but what I can tell you is there's no family, and that made her free to follow Jesus once she was free of those demons. I can also tell you that 8 times she's mentioned on a list with other women, and she's usually listed first. Now, does that mean she's the head? I don't know, but it sure looks like it. 5 times she's mentioned in connection with the resurrection of Jesus. She stood by the cross in John 19, verse 25. So it's not just Jesus, Jesus's mother, it's also Mary Magdalene. And honestly, when I'm walking along and I'm thinking about the women, those columns that are out there in the foreground as you walk in, those columns have on them the written names of women in the Gospels. I just simply call them the other 12. Here's what I did. I was embarrassed that I didn't have good stories of those other 12. So I went back and I went from the beginning of the Gospels to the end, and I collected up these women. And can I tell you that I found that there are 2 kinds of women that are in the New Testament, in the background of the Gospels. Some of them are people who were stooped by problems, and those problems led them to an encounter with Jesus. Others were people who were, I'm just going to call them special ministering angels, because they just show up at the moment Jesus needs them to be there. And let me just tell you about a few of them. And I think maybe the background of this is that God is not the God of small dreams. The question is not how big God is. The question is, how much am I willing to trust him? Let me say it another way. God's plan for you is bigger than your plan for you. And every day I walk in mutiny against him, I release the best plan for a second mock-up. So many of us have lived so many years that we can honestly say, even those of us who've walked with the Lord Jesus, I can tell you I've lived many, many days for Randy. They were dead-end days, living the wrong life. It's also important for me to say this. In the Bible, the only hero is God. Everyone else is a screw-up. I think that's important to say, because I think we look at them floating Teflon-like across the flannel graph of our memory, thinking, here's Mary Magdalene. Listen, the woman had 7 demons. She had a few things that had to be dealt with before she came to Jesus, okay? She's got a past, but so do you, and so do I. I went looking. The first woman who caught my attention was Elizabeth. And one of the reasons is, the Christmas story is always told in such romantic Hallmark terms. Elizabeth's life was really great at the end. But for years, she sought God looking for the one thing that mattered to her. She wanted a baby. And for some reason, every other woman got to the well and could laugh about their baby and talk about how their children were growing up. And Elizabeth came back sad every time. Her husband, Zacharias, pleaded with God, but God didn't listen to his prayers, or so he thought. So he selected the time in the temple when he was supposed to go of the course of Avia. He showed up at the temple, and the lot fell on him to represent the prayers of Israel. And he thought, oh, great. God never listens to my prayer. This is going to be great. All right, I'll do the shtick. I'll go in and mix the incense and throw it on there, but God isn't going to listen because he never does. Poof. Gabriel. God heard you. Really? Now, the reason that Zacharias asks questions and Mary asks questions, but Zacharias gets told, you don't speak, and Mary gets off easy, is that Zacharias has a life lived of cynicism. Mary's just starting. Don't make her so much holier than him. She doesn't have enough years underneath praying that her wife won't sob herself to sleep tonight. You know this is true. Hurt me, and that's one thing. Hurt my wife, and that's a lot deeper. And I got to tell you, when the love of your life is hurting and there's nothing you can do, I don't know a pain that's worse than that. I don't care if it's your child, I don't care if it's your spouse, you stand there like an idiot. I think Zacharias walked into that room heartbroken. I think Elizabeth had an optimism Zacharias never had. You know how I know? Because when Gabriel appeared to Mary, Mary was sent to Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth got the message that Mary was with child, she knew right away. When Elizabeth was with child, she agreed right away. There was no resistance in Elizabeth. There was resistance in Zachariah. And there was a reason. It wasn't the physical problem of having a baby. It was the lack of belief, because that's always our problem. It's not that we don't think God can do it. It's we think he does it for somebody else and not us. Like his love for them is greater than his love for me. Because if he loved me, why would I be stuck here doing this? Elizabeth is the one who lifts everybody in the story. And if you read closely, she's the one who believed when nobody else did. I don't know how she arrived at the faithfulness of God, but I know she did. So let me stop and say the Elizabeth story is this. It doesn't matter what happened to you, it matters what you believe about God. That changes everything. If you know he is good, then whether or not what the doctor tells you is favorable is not the end of that sentence. If God is good, he'll be good with me no matter where I am. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. I was attracted to Anna. I mean, they take the baby, they go, Jesus is taken to be circumcised, and Mary's coming up. And here's Anna. And talk about a life interrupted. Anna has an 8-year marriage that she loses her husband. And God steps in. And her husband's gone. And she should go out and get married again, but she doesn't. Instead, she goes to the temple and she stays there for a whole generation. And she's just living life waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And what we don't think of is, what if Anna said, hey, it's a Tuesday, I'm not getting up today. I've been doing this for years. I mean, really, do I need to go today to see if the Messiah is there? She could have missed what God was doing today because that's the day she chose not to be obedient. I have a walk-on part in the movie of God. I get 3 frames in a 1,000,000-frame movie. And in those 3 frames, the only thing that will mean anything to me 100 million years from now is whether or not I was standing on the right spot, giving the right lines in the movie. And it's worth remembering that she lived a whole generation waiting for a baby to show up. I mean, Simeon's over there going, now I can die, But Anna's like, she's just doing her thing day after day. But you have to remember, she lives in a time when women are measured by whether or not they're having children. And God took her family away so that he could give her the privilege of holding in her hands the Savior of the world. She was like a Naomi story. You got to lose it to get it. And I go through these stories. I see this widow at Nain in Luke 7, and Jesus is walking along the road, and here's a woman who's lost her son. And when you're a widow and you've lost your only son, that is the equivalence of destitute. Without a male heir, a woman can't transfer property. That's the Ruth story, right? So she can buy, she can sell. You did the Proverbs 31 thing. She slices, she dices, but wait, there's more. But she can't do anything without a male heir. and she's just lost hers, and she's mourning, and Jesus comes up and raises up the child and gives the child to the mother. What Luke 7 expects you to know is that under the ministry of Elisha, the same thing had happened on the other side of the same mountain. And that's why the people said, one greater than the prophets is among us. This is a rerun miracle. But for that woman, Jesus was saving her life, saving her family name. I'm thinking about Luke 7 and a woman coming in and sobbing and wiping Jesus' feet with her tears. What's her story? Wouldn't you like to know how deep the pain was involved in that story? That if I can just come near to where he is, if I could just for a minute be in his presence. How about the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4? Yeah, women went out together an hour after sunrise, an hour before sundown. Here's what you would never find. A woman alone at a well in midday who is loved by her husband. A good wife who can find, she's more precious than gemstones. You would never let your wife go by herself. You also wouldn't toss 100 shekels on the ground and leave it there, because somebody's going to take it. And so here's a woman who's standing at a well by herself. Now remember, her problem isn't that she's a loose woman. Women don't get divorces in the New Testament. Men divorce women. And so 5 times repeatedly, she is put off. And the man that has her now doesn't even think she's worth anything, and she's standing there worthless at a well when she runs into Jesus. Tell me if her life was bad, because that's what led her to be there when Jesus showed up. Sometimes we look at our past and we go, oh, the terrible things I had to go through. That's what put you on the corner where Jesus was. Does Jesus have the right to send you to the ER because there's a nurse that needs to hear something? Does he have the right? Because we talk about him as though he's Santa Claus in the sky. If you have not met the God that will disappoint what you want because he knows what he wants, then you do not know the God of the Bible. Because the bottom line is God and I am not. So I only know what it looks like. My tire blew out, I'm mad, I'm beside the side of the road, and I'm about to meet the person who will become my spouse. It is a Tuesday. No one marks that on their calendar as I'm going to meet the love of my life. But God does. He says, I got somebody I need you to meet. Blow that tire. And slow down. You know, I was driving across Pennsylvania, incredibly tired. I don't know why I was tired. I slept well, and I just got to Western Pennsylvania on the toll road, and I just had to pull off. I pulled into a truck stop. I got a cup of coffee, and immediately a series of emergency vehicles began to go by. 5 miles up the road, 18 cars. Guess where I was going to be? I was grousing about being tired until I realized that maybe I don't see everything. I'm looking at these ladies and I'm thinking to myself, there's a woman caught in adultery and she's thrown down in front of Jesus, and Jesus is drawing on the floor in the temple. Now, we don't know what he was drawing. I suspect he's writing the names of the people the guys standing around are having affairs with, you know, Madge, Agnes, you know. You want to scare these guys? That's the way to do it right there. Like, just in case anybody's wondering, this is, you know, but you remember what he said? They threw her down, and he said, let him who is without sin do what? Cast the first stone. Now, under the law, who should cast the first stone? The offended party. What Jesus was saying is, where's her husband? See, here's the thing. If she committed adultery, then you can stone her. But if he's also doing this, then you're not stoning her and letting him off. And then he said this, I'm the light of the world. Don't mess with me, I see what's going on. See, the light that is a comfort to the believer is an offense to the non-believer. The same light that makes you able to see truth hurts the eyes of a person who lives in darkness. And so here you have it. Jesus says, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. If her husband is here and he's innocent, then she's going to be stoned today. Because that's the law. It's not that Jesus used to believe that in the law and now he doesn't. We have Christians writing weird things like, Jesus overturned the law. He said in Matthew 5, I did not come to overturn the law. Okay, that's good enough for me. What he's saying is, yeah, I wrote the law. But what I'm telling you is you're not using the law to beat people. Either this is done equitably or nobody's dying today. But what's her deal? He turns to her and says, go, knock it off. Go sin no more. You don't have to say a lot of words to say big things. A simple, who was it? Was it Hemingway? They did the contest on the shortest book written, and he wrote this story, Baby Shoes for Sale, Never Worn. You don't have to use a lot of words to say a big story. Go and sin no more. I'm thinking about financial followers. Did you know that Jesus has no financial followers that are named in the Gospels that are men? Only women. Does that mean no men gave? No, I'm just saying that these were the ones that were named. And the Spirit of God decided that's what we needed to know. In other words, some of you are not coming in with the big past. Some of you grew up in a Christian home. I was a striptease bar worker at age 3. You don't have anything. You're just like, I came up in Sunday school. I always kind of knew. Then I gave my heart to Jesus in junior high. Here I am. You don't need a cool story. You can be that person who faithfully gives and faithfully serves, because for every person who has that sparkly story, there's 1,000 people that hold the thing together. I've learned over time that in the giftedness of the body, the gifts that are up front get all the glory, but the gifts that are in the back do all the work. You only know sound men when the sound doesn't work, right? And it's really good that somebody turned the lights on. And I don't really know all that stuff. I just come in and preach whatever I prepared. And people go, oh, what a great message. Fine, but you know what? You couldn't hear it if the sound guy didn't do his job. It takes 1,000 people doing the right thing to give a platform to one person to get the special room to speak in. And sometimes, honestly, we're living in a time when sometimes you can come and talk to your friend about Jesus and they'll come to Jesus, but sometimes it takes 8 people carrying him because he's lame. And honestly, that's just what happens. Some people need more to get there, and that's okay, because God loves them too. Now, what I found interesting is, how about Jairus' daughter? Or the Syrophoenician woman? What's her deal? She's up there running around and please, my daughter's lying at the point of death. It's not right for me to give the food of the children to the dogs. Yeah, but even the dogs get the scraps from the table. Like, nothing, that's all I get. I'm willing to take whatever you have. Jesus looks at the woman and sees that she gets it. Over and over and over, I find that when you look at these women, some of them were beat down and stooped over, and God met them in their stooped position. Others, we don't have that story. We just have a story of a person in strength. But I would remind you, most of the 12 are sad stories before they're happy stories. Now, why is that a good thing? That sounds depressing, Randy. I mean, really. Because what turns the story around is the encounter with God. I don't care where you've been. That doesn't determine where you're going. What determines where you're going is who you meet and what you'll do about that meeting. And when that turns, it'll change for you. We hear about these men, Jacob, Bartholomew, son Alphaeus. Judas is even pictured here. You never get Judas anymore, but this is a modern piece. So Philip is over here. Simon Peter over here. Has to be up front because it's Simon Peter. And you get all these pictures of these men, but here's what you don't get. Running behind the story. Do you know one of the ones I love the most? Peter's mother-in-law. You know why I really like her? Mark chapter 1. Don't miss it. Jesus walks into a synagogue, gets a frontal attack by a demonic force. Understand this. The devil never throws one punch, ever. He's a combination puncher. Please pay attention. He throws the punch, Jesus deals with the demon. Can't land a punch on him, Peter's mother-in-law gets sick. I pastored for a lot of years. Can I tell you the truth? My kids never ran away on any day but Saturday night. Can't get to me, you'll get to them. And if you stop her and make her sick, you slow down the whole progress, because now the boys have to get busy making their own lunches because she's tied up. That's how the enemy works. He throws multiple punches. So Mark chapter 1 tells a beautiful combo punch story. Watch for the number of demons that show up in the first 8 chapters of Mark, because the gloves are off and they're going after him. But they'll go after the people he cares about when they can't get at him. When I'm doing well, I'm praying like mad for my wife. Because we've been saying for years, it's okay if one of us is down as long as both of us aren't down at the same time. Anybody else have that story? Because what happens is I'll be doing okay and she won't be. So I would just remind you, the stories of the other 12, aren't they good stories? How come we don't tell those stories as many times as we tell the stories of the first 12? There is a sensitivity that God gave to women that he didn't give to the men that I know. I'm not saying none. I'm just saying all the ones I know. Okay? Thank God it wasn't designed to be an all-male review. But there's another 12. Okay? Questions? This is a great chapel, isn't it?
This is the Church of Mary Magdalene.
So it's a chapel, and it's actually, its name translates launch out into the deep. That's what it's the chapel of launch out into the deep. So you're supposed to look at this, see like an infinity pool or something, which works when you don't have rain coming down on it. And this, gives you the whole idea of this ship. Now, the side chapels are all different things that happen around the Sea of Galilee, and the center posts there all are the names of different women. Well, thanks for joining us in Magdala. I hope that you spend some time there hearing about the importance of these women that God used powerfully to build up the ministry of Jesus, to support Jesus, even to feed the disciples. What a tremendous opportunity we had just looking at Magdala. Join us next time as we keep on exploring the lands of the Bible.